You're listening to KTAL-LP 101.5, Las Cruces, New Mexico.
Good morning and welcome to Take on Faith. I am your host, Reverend Kalani Kachela, or XK. Each week we'll explore matters of faith, spirituality, and current issues affecting our experience of the human condition. We'll have a thought-provoking guest on each episode. Thank you for joining me. Let's jump right on in.
This is Reverend Carolyn Wilkins. Reverend Talani is on military duty this weekend, and I'm your host. Our guests today are Reverend Sandra Jackson and Reverend Patty Rumpza. So now we welcome Reverend Sandra Jackson and Reverend Patty Rumpza to KTAL and a world that is in need of healing and comfort. So I'm going to start with Reverend Sandra Jackson, and I'll give a brief overview of who they are. They are working together at an organization called Golden Heart Center. And the spiritual community is focused on creating heart-expanding experiences of oneness through teaching, coaching, and sacred travel. Together, they help individuals and communities create lives of wholeness, abundance, and joy. I've had the opportunity to work with Reverend Sandra many years ago. She was one of my first spiritual teachers as I began over 30 years ago, and we have remained cohorts and friends for many years. So welcome, Reverend Sandra. I'd like to have you share with the guests a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and some of your interests as a child.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this show today, Carolyn. It is an honor and a privilege. I am truly grateful to have this experience with you. And what a joy it is to see you advancing in this manner. Yes, we have known each other for quite a few years, and it is so much of a pleasure to be able to be with you today. Technically, I'm a native New Yorker, but I moved to California as a child when I was 12 years old, so I think of myself more as a Californian, but I now live in Georgia, outside of Atlanta, in metro Atlanta. And growing up, I grew up in a home that was loving and caring. Although my parents, were divorced, my parents remained friends. And I think that's part of the reason why it made it easy for me to transition into a faith tradition that encouraged people to experience the oneness that they have with one another, because we all have the capacity to love one another. And sometimes it doesn't always seem that way, but we all have that capacity. I came to my spiritual tradition through the death of my sister. She was 24 at the time, and even though I had begun to meditate, she had introduced me to the teachings of the Self-Realization Fellowship. And, that was quite a few years ago. And it was through that experience that I realized that we are more than just this life, that there is something greater in our lives. And I've come to realize it and think of it as our spiritual life having experience in human form. So I don't want to take up all our time. I want to let Patty share a little bit about herself.
Yes, and we'll get into the spirituality of it all shortly. Thank you so much. And Reverend Patty, would you please share with the audience where you are right now and where you grew up?
Hi, everyone. I am so grateful and thankful to be here today and with all of you this morning. Right now, I am in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I have lived here for a few years. Originally, I am from St. Paul, Minnesota, or a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, and I left Minnesota in 1982, and I made my big move to the south, Houston, Texas, that I have mostly been in for about 30 years, so it was a bit of a transition, growing up in a northern Midwestern state, moving to the south. And so that's where I lived, and then I began to travel some, but mostly I've lived in Houston and Oklahoma and Colorado. And so growing up, I was raised in a very traditional faith tradition, and and my house was not harmonious. It was quite dysfunctional. And so my only solace as a young child was talking to the God of my understanding. Though I have to admit I got in a lot of trouble for that. But that's how my journey started, of growing up in a disharmonious atmosphere, searching for some harmony and peace and love, which I discovered a little bit later, by the time I was about 25. So that's how my journey started, and I've been friends with Sandra for over 20 years, and we have a lot of fun together and a lot of joy together, and again, I'm so grateful to be with all of you today.
Thank you so much. And you both tiptoed in a little bit into your journey of what happened and what may have influenced you on your spiritual journey or religious journey. And because this is Take on Faith, we like to delve into that kind of conversation. So while I heard from both of you that there were influences from family life and how you began, I'd like to share a little bit about what was the religious background or spiritual practice of your birth family, and what did they teach you about religion? Patty, would you like to start?
Oh, my. So my birth family on both of my parents' sides was Catholic, and mostly because my parents were divorced, I spent time with my grandparents, and so it was my grandfather who took us to church, and I went to Catholic school, Catholic, all of that. And I'm going to separate what I was taught from the church and school because as a young child, I just didn't believe it. That was my biggest journey, is I didn't believe what I was told, though I very much practiced it. What I learned from my grandfather was he always modeled kindness and compassion and love. And so I don't know if I attributed that to his spirituality or religion, because while we were very much Catholic and went to church and went to parochial school, it was only my grandfather was the only family member growing up. My mother did not seem to go, and my dad was not around, and my grandmother didn't attend. So it was my grandfather, but it was very clear that that's who we were, is Catholics.
Well, thank you so much. It's so interesting that I grew up Baptist. My parents practiced baptism, but when I was in the 3rd or 4th grade, I was friends with a young lady who was Catholic, and she and I were best buddies, so I would walk with her to catechism class and sit in the church while she was in class, and I'd sit there by myself mostly, and it was a pretty nice-sized cathedral, and with stained glass windows and, all of these statues that happen in certain Catholic churches. And I'd sit there by myself, and I recognized I probably was a meditator before because I love to sit by water and oceans and stuff and be still. But it was there that I really stepped into this place of spiritual meditation and prayer because I was sitting by myself. And one day a priest came by, and he had been watching me, and he said, because he'd always say hello, but then he came over and said, talked to me, asked what I was doing, and that next semester I attended catechism. So I don't tell this story to everyone, but it was a wonderful journey of learning, but I decided to not get my first communion because of two things, and Patty, you'll probably laugh about this. I didn't feel like it was necessary to go to confession every week because I said, I'm good. I'm a good girl. And it was a recognition about commitment and integrity. I didn't know it at that time, but I know it now.
Right.
That I didn't think I could be honest in saying I'm going to go every week when I didn't think there was a reason to go. So I was combative of the idea of having to go to confession every week, but that was a promise you had to make if you became Catholic.
So, Carolyn, when you're saying that, what is so interesting for me is the pivotal moment. I never had an awareness that I had a choice externally, and I was actually pretty excited for First Communion because we got presents and a party, so I was pretty superficial on that level. However, it was part of the process of confession, and everyone has very different experiences, but it was, as going to Catholic school, you had to go to confession every week because that was part of it. And it was being 7 years old and going in and saying that I hadn't done anything. I was 7 years old, and I got in a lot of trouble, and I could always remember it. It was in that moment, so I'm 7 years old, and in that moment I knew that the God that they believed or that was taught, by that priest was not the same one that I believed because I was only 7. And so that was one of my most pivotal foundational moments as a child. Even though I was still Catholic, even though I was still in a Catholic family, I knew that the God of my understanding that I talked to and communed with was different. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, the different levels of awareness. And again, recognizing people had many different experiences. That was just mine where I grew up.
Yes. So I laugh sometimes when I think about that, and I'm like, I was like 8 years old, and I told the priest that. And, of course, the nuns were like, they almost had a heart attack.
I'm sure they did.
Because I was not accepting. Even though I'd gone to catechism and gone through the whole process, I said, no, thank you. So, Sandra, why don't you tell us about your initial teachings of your family? And by the way, I had the opportunity to know Sandra's mother and her grandmother, and absolutely wonderful. It's one of the gifts of my life.
Well, excuse me, I had a much more eclectic background and not the awarenesses that you all had at 7 and 8. Mine came much later. But, my father went to a Presbyterian church, so when my mother got married, she went to the Presbyterian church, and so that's where we went when we lived in Brooklyn. And my grandmother, however, and my mother was raised Baptist, and she continued to be. So in the summers, when we'd go to Rochester and visit my grandmother, we'd go to Baptist church. In the winter, when we lived in New York, we went to Presbyterian church. We had friends. I had a friend who lived upstairs from us, and she was Catholic, and she was going through, the communion and everything, and I wanted to do all that because she got to wear a little white bride dress. However, my mother said, no, we're not Catholics because, get this, we believe that you can talk to God and we don't need a pope to talk for us. So that was the reason for us not having anything to do with Catholicism. However, my grandparents were Seventh-day Adventists. And so because they were Seventh-day Adventists, we were allowed to go to Seventh-day Adventist school. So I went to private school for 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. I went to the Seventh-day Adventist school. They had us memorize every part of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, I swear. I had so many Bible verses that I had to memorize that it really kind of turns me off from reading any part of that part of the Bible. I still have a hard time reading that part. But then when we moved to California, we went to Presbyterian church. My grandmother continued to go to the Baptist church, and the Baptist minister kept trying to get us to go to the Baptist church. My mother's like, nope, we're Presbyterian, so we're going to go to Presbyterian church. Now, my awakening came when I was like 21, I guess, and it was around that time that the voting rights marches were being held in Selma, and the minister from our church, the council of churches at the time were all white men, basically. They were all going to go to Selma to do the march. And the minister at our church, our Presbyterian church, wanted to go on that march as well. And the Board of Elders, which runs the church in the Presbyterian church, told our minister that that was none of our business, and they did not sanction his going. And so he did not defy them. He did not go. And at that point, my mother and I left the church. I was like, what do you mean? This is not our business. I don't understand. And so I didn't go to church for quite a few years. It wasn't until my sister passed away, as I was saying earlier, that I began to, well, maybe a little bit before that, because I started meditation classes with a woman from, my mom and I actually did it together, meditation classes with a woman from the Infinite Way, which is Joel Goldsmith's teaching. And so that's when I started with the meditation. But I was like 27, 28 by that time. So, like I said, my awakening, to my spirituality came much later. However, the eclecticness of my background has really, I think, added to who I am, spiritually today.
Well, thank you so much for the journey. I relate to yours, Sandra, also because I was growing up Baptist, and at the same time, we had a journey of, because some of our cousins were Methodists, so we did the Methodist work, and there were a lot of other places that we visited every so often, because we go down south, and Southern Baptists is really different than another Baptist. And so there are varieties within each of the sectors also. So I'd like to take a moment and do our little preview here. You're listening to Take on Faith on KTAL-LP 101.5 FM. I'm your host, Reverend Carolyn Wilkins, and my guests today are Reverend Sandra Jackson and Reverend Patty Rumpza. and we are delighted to have them here. We welcome your text messages or calls at 575-201-3321. So I'm going to have us delve into another place of our spirituality and our religious practice. I actually use the terms interchangeably, but some of our listeners may not consider that what they do, because some people consider spirituality different than religiosity. So what is it that you do today? How did you get into your ministry? What faith is your ministry under? And tell us a little bit about your church and your congregation. Sandra, would you like to begin?
Sure. Okay, so I am a religious science minister, also known as the Science of Mind. My church in Douglasville, Georgia, is the Center for Spiritual Living, West Georgia. Right now, we are enjoying virtual as well as in-person meeting. And we are a spiritual community that believes everyone is, we are all one, that there's not a separation between us as individuals because we're all spiritual beings. We come from a tradition that believes that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. And perhaps people have heard of Wayne Dwyer, Louise Hay, and others. Even Deepak Chopra, has taught some of the same teachings that we have espoused. But our actual spiritual teachings are one that I'm trying to think of how to say this in a way that is not in jargon. Let me put it that way. Instead, what I think I want to say is that we believe that what you think, what you believe, and what you experience is all something that you are completely responsible for. We believe definitely that God is, but we also believe that God is within us. God is transparent, and it is within, immanent, and at the same time, it is larger than you are. It's infinite. And we have found that the quantum physics actually is confirming our beliefs these days. Our teachings are ancient and spiritual. They're eclectic in the sense that we believe that there are truths to be found in all religions. So Catholicism has truth, Buddhism has truth, Islam has this truth, Christianity has truth, and that we can all be a part of the fullness and the completeness of that there are many paths to the Spirit, and that each person has their own path, and yet at the same time, when we come to our Centers for Spiritual Living, then we encourage people to do the work themselves, to take classes, to learn to do prayer work, which we call spiritual mind treatment, and to use that vehicle to change their lives along with noticing their beliefs, what it is that they believe, and learning to expand those beliefs. We believe also that there is a world that can work for everyone, that harmony is heaven's first law, and that because that harmony is a spiritual law, then it means that we can all have the experiences of our own lives without hurting somebody else. Let me put it that way. And that healing is possible because everything that we experience is a condition, and any conditions that we have can be healed. Does that answer your question?
That's a good overview. And I would like to ask you a follow-up question because I didn't include a big part of your life, that you were a teacher. And so would you share with the audience a quick summary of what you taught, where you taught, and how that informed your being a minister today?
I taught, elementary ages from first grade to fifth grade in California, Allen Rock Union School District in San Jose. And I started studying the science of mind when I was teaching. And I started working with the children and doing, we didn't call it meditation at the time, but quiet times. And I found that there were ideas that I could use in the classroom with the children that really supported them and had them to be able to experience things that, maybe they hadn't, it just enlarged their possibilities. But I also realized that teaching wasn't for me. I wanted to do more than the confines of the classroom and the confines of the school system. And so I studied to become a minister, and I started a church in California, which was the Firelight Science and Mind Center and Church of Religious Science, and Carolyn came along there as a member of that church. She was one of the founding members of our church. And, so that teaching experience has served me well because I have used all of those teaching techniques and behaviors and thoughts, and I really enjoy teaching, and so I've continued it as I have, progressed through my ministry.
Thank you so much. And Reverend Patty, I'll ask you the questions in reverse. Given you going to school, what was your initial work in the world, and what did you do most of the time? And when did you step into ministry?
So I fortunately was able to start fairly young. I'm coming on my 22nd year of ministry. And so I started in the philosophy, the same as Sandra's, Science of Mind Centers for Spiritual Living, it's now called. When I walked into my first community in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when I was 25, and about a year later, I started working with teenagers in the local spiritual center there, and that was my entrance into ministry. Is that I began working with teens, and I began working in regional youth programs, but mostly the driving factor for everything that I did was I was in so much pain, and I was in so much depression, and I was in so much agony that I wanted a relief. And when I walked into my first community in Albuquerque in 1987, I knew that they believed what I did. And so I began ministry by being in service to others. And I worked locally and regionally and nationally with our youth and teens. And there was always this part that kept saying that you're to be a minister, which I thought was an absolutely crazy idea, 100%. I sat when I heard that message, and I was like, God, this is Patty Rumpza. Don't you know who I am? You can't be talking to me. And I was that plain and visceral that I sat on my bed. However, I decided to do this thing anyways. And so that was my journey. And I do separate religion from spirituality, My line is practical spirituality for everyday living. Is for me, what has always driven me was that I really didn't know why I was here, but I wanted to become happy, and I wanted to have peace. And so for me, it's always been about having a relationship with what I used to call God. Now I call it the divine. And is that I wanted to know God from when I was a little girl. So that was my compelling, motivating factor. And then I want to experience God. So besides ministry that I've done I'm in my 50s now, so for a long time, the other part of my life has been, my family has all been in business and construction, so a business background in accounting and bookkeeping that I've done sometimes at the same time, sometimes separately, but that is my background that has gone in addition to it. But I have really been on this path since I have been in my 20s, and 2 years ago I stepped away from my full-time position at a spiritual community in Colorado, and I rested for a while. And then I decided I had more to share with the world because I love seeing people connect to the divine of their understanding, and I'm committed to healing this planet. So I got back into ministry, and we started a virtual, it's called a special focus ministry called Golden Heart Spiritual Communities with Sandra, and that's what we're doing. So of all the things at the opening that you shared, but for me, I'm driven by making the information relevant to our lives, because for me, if it's not relevant and it's not uplifting your life and it's not changing your life, there's no value. And for me, my life totally transformed. I went from wanting to kill myself on a regular daily, weekly basis, monthly for sure, to being happy. So that has been my journey into ministry, and it's that which continues to propel me to this day.
Carolyn, I forgot to mention, that's how Patty and I met first, is that we were both youth leaders. I did it for about 10 years before I started the church. And but that's how she and I met, is as we were regional youth ministers back in the 80s. So, yeah. Well, I could tell as she was telling the story. I said, "Oh, that's where they met," because I knew that you had been involved in the youth program. Yeah. I also heard newly that you were in Albuquerque, which is 200 miles from me, but it's still New Mexico. Mm-hmm. And so now I know why you were surprised that I was in Las Cruces. It is a journey to have come. I began was born in New York City, went to school in Ohio, wound up in California, and I was in California for 40 years, and then now I'm in New Mexico, and it's a new world. It's a different world. Yep, truly is. And it's a combination because you talked about coming from Colorado and Minnesota. There are a lot of Minnesotans here in New Mexico, and it's a mixture of people that are different than some of the mixtures that I grew up in, and I've been involved in with many backgrounds, from living in Brooklyn where there were different areas that people lived in. They call them ghettos, but it didn't have a negative term to it. And so I grew up around people who were Italian, who were Jewish, who were Muslim, just all, because everybody came to New York City. And it's one of the intriguing things of being in New Mexico, because it's possible people may be here from all over, but it's hard to tell. Yeah. So, and the majority of people, it's a different mixture of people and cultures and other things. So that's what I'm getting used to
in a new place, but I'm enjoying the people who are here. I'm enjoying the amazing mountains, and there's a sacredness that shows up. You both talked about the sacredness within, and being in Las Cruces, I've not only continued to delve into, through meditation, the sacredness within and supporting the people in our congregation of Inspirational Ministries, but I've also become more in tune to the energetic power and the vibration of the land that I've always recognized and honored, but here it's visible and palpable, as they say. So before we go into our next break, I want to ask, because you two are doing something special that I am going to have the opportunity to join you on. So would one of you like to give a brief introduction to a trip that you're putting together called the Alabama Civil Rights Experience? And if you do a brief version, we'll come back and talk about it more after our short break.
Go, Sandra.
Okay, so in April, we are taking a tour to the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, along with the Memorial Park there. It is the site of where slaves were sold, in Montgomery. And it's going to be a weekend. It's going to be Thursday through Sunday. And we're looking at going also to Selma as part of that trip. So we're going to start in Atlanta and possibly start and end in Atlanta and then go to Montgomery. So we can talk more about that when we get back.
Okay. Thank you. It's an interesting trip during a very interesting time in the history of our country. So I want to let those who are listening, who may have just tuned in, that you're listening to Take on Faith on KTAL-LP 101.5 FM. I'm your host this morning, Reverend Carolyn Wilkins, and my guests today are Reverend Sandra Jackson and Reverend Patty Rumpza. They are right now putting together and discussing an upcoming trip that's open to everyone called the Alabama Civil Rights Experience. And it's going to be a very interesting opportunity. And the reason I thought it would be very important to share a little bit about this trip is that there is a seeming disconnect between different groups of people in the United States today. My overview is I came up during the civil rights era, and my perspective says we've been on a projection of good, of change, of opening and opportunity. And clearly the perspective of some people in the country is that what I see as good, they don't see as good. What I see as expansion, they see as a threat. What I see as learning about each other and honoring each other, others see as a problem in this country, which is why the phrase, the MAGA phrase was used, Make America Great Again, implying that the trajectory we've been on has not taken us to a greater place. So I invite you both to comment on what I just shared. and also how this trip is going to impact those who go, what they can anticipate, and how they will experience it. Sandra, would you like to begin?
Okay, so Carolyn, our spiritual organization has a vision that says we want to have a world that works for everyone. Excuse me. And so if we have a world that works for everyone, then we have to see ourselves as one global family, don't we? And we have to begin to respect the interconnectedness of our own lives and realize that there's a kinship that we have regardless of what color skin we happen to be wearing or whatever political beliefs we have, whatever religious beliefs we have. That all of these things can be reconciled in some way. Historically, we have had a lot of separation, and the museum in Montgomery provides, for those of us who are wanting to realize that we have in this country a foundation of saying that some people are superior and others are inferior. I have been to the museum, and there are thoughts, beliefs, quotes from people who have, said things that other people have come to believe and then act on, which are simply not true. And so we are having this trip not just so that people can walk through the museum, because anybody can walk through the museum. We are also inviting people to participate in some dialogue and conversations before the trip so that they're prepared for what they're going to experience. And then during the trip, we have dialogues and conversations each evening after we visit the various museums so that people will have the opportunity to discuss what it is they've experienced and find the connection between one another. And when we can find a connection with someone who is different from us, then we can extrapolate that to other relationships. The science, the people who study these things have discovered if people live in communities with people who are different, they're much more open and available to have relationships with those people and see them more as equals and entitled to have the same, levels of good that they have. In other words, that they are willing to have them work, be in the world together with them. And so this trip is just so that we can begin to have those experiences, because we don't all live next door to people who are different from us. And this trip gives us an opportunity to experience other people's ideas and experiences. Patty, you want to give your take on it?
Yes. I think that it's understanding my journey is that I was raised in a suburb of St. Paul that was all white. There was one black family and maybe two Hispanic families when I was growing up. Yet I would find myself going to St. Paul that was more diverse. And so I had a diverse group of friends, even though everyone around me was white culturally. And what I began to realize is that the experience of my friends of color were much different than mine. I witnessed a lot of things happen to them from various experiences. I witnessed with my own eyes the different treatment that they received by police and other places. And so I knew that was part of it because I witnessed it, I've seen it. I have real friends since I was a teenager, even though, again, my culture was white. And so then as we progressed into civil rights and harmony and oneness and having a philosophy that we are all one has been pivotal to me. What I began to experience as a minister, as I began to have a pulpit, and especially when I was in western Colorado, was that, and that was at the same time we started going through a greater divide within our country, is what I recognized is that well-meaning, loving white people, they just didn't see it. They could not see it. They did not understand. And then I began to have discussions, and that many of them never have known a person of color. That, they may have seen somebody, but they were not friends. And so there was no understanding of the experience of other people within our community, which became very passionate. So as things unfolded, I knew that they were not trying to not understand, but they had no experience, and thus they just had very large missing gaps. And so fast forward to, I began to try to describe, and I began to teach and share about our bias and all of those things, because I pivotally believe that it is the responsibility of white people to heal the racism within our country, because it is part of our cultural heritage. And I have been blessed to have had many, many friends of color who've helped me walk this path to have a greater understanding. And I believe people are basically good, and they want the well-being of all people, and that it's only because they don't know the other, as they would refer to it, that comes in fear. And so I want people to understand about other people and about understanding the roots of our history and our country. And so how did this tour specifically come about is that I was with Sandra, and I went through the museum, and I could see how much different it was for her to go through this tour than it was for myself, and I could understand of how much we didn't know, is that where this unconscious bias, where these things come from. And Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Legacy Museum, his nonprofit, he happened to be on CBS on Sunday, and he said that we must confront our unpleasant history as the first steps of healing. And so for me, I'm about creating a world that works for everyone. I am about having oneness and celebrating one another, truly celebrating. My life is rich because I have such a culturally diverse friends. And I want us to live in harmony, and I believe that we must actually see, witness, and experience. And so all of those things that Sandra said are true, and that we will do this in a safe and loving environment, and that there will be those of us as guides to help us understand. Because for myself, there was a lot of stuff I wasn't aware of, but then I began to understand where these things came from, and that as individually we can't heal until we become aware. I believe collectively in our country we can't heal our country until we became aware. And for me, I agree with you, Carolyn, that yes, things are unfolding well. However, for me, it's a little too slow, and I want to help speed up the process by having more people join us.
And Carolyn,
I thank you both for your perspective. When I was reflecting,
Carolyn, can I add
something? What did you want to add? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just want to say that I came up through that whole period of encounter groups and, people confronting one another. And I have done diversity work for a while, and I have discovered that those groups don't work. That what you need is a safe environment for people to learn and grow. And that, and so that's what we're busy creating. Like Patty said, we're creating an environment that's safe, that's secure, that's sacred, and yet at the same time, it is not so safe that you don't get confronted with the beliefs that you have and get the opportunity to make changes and ask questions and learn so that you can, be more of a participatory person in our complete society. Okay, that's it.
Yes. Well, I think it's so important to emphasize a safe environment.
Yes.
Reverend Sandra, you take me back to a program that we did about 4 years ago for URI, United Religious Initiative. And we were in Washington, D.C. I had the opportunity to put together a workshop series for the organization who were bringing religious people from all over the world. Mm-hmm. And we came together at George Mason University in Washington, D.C., and I had the honor of working with 7 amazing youth and spiritual leaders who helped us lead a program about diversity. And I won't go into the details of it, but we had one group that looked at challenges within religion, others in racial background, sexual differences, education and housing. We did different perspectives of equality and also within religion, that there are challenges and problems of being a woman. In most religions, the perspective of who should be speaking from the pulpit is different. And most women were not seen as leaders, as an example. But anyway, we had 7 different areas that we looked at, and the people who came to our workshop and divided up gave us such wonderful feedback by saying that they had never considered these situations, going back to what you were saying, Reverend Patty, that we have differences which we're taught, but they're not necessarily real. They're not valid. They're not always true, because we actually keep talking about differences of race, and the science is telling us that there really aren't differences. There are differences in coloration, but not necessarily differences in our core. So we look at color, we look at culture, we look at practices, and they are different, and foods, and how we may raise our family. But at the core, we are all the same. Mm-hmm. And I love the analogy that people have talked about, that when you're in the hospital and you need a heart transplant, mm-hmm. the heart can come from anyone. Yeah. Although there have been people that I know who want to reject blood that may come from people that are not from their own background, but not recognizing that science doesn't support their ideas. So as we go into the closing moments of this show, I want to just share again that the opportunity to participate in the Alabama Civil Rights Experience is going to happen April 28th through May the 1st of 2022, that you can go to the website goldenheartsc.org to learn more about it and to sign up. It will be an experience that I think anyone can enjoy, and your hosts and guides include our 2 wonderful guests today, Reverend Dr. Sandra Jackson, Reverend Patty Rumpza. I'm going to be one of the guides also, Reverend Carolyn Wilkins, and we also have Reverend David Alexander, who will be attending. And I encourage you to look into this, because the more we come together and better understand the experiences that we've had, then the better we can understand each other. And I always say the best way to see what we think about each other is to watch
preschoolers on a playground because they don't discriminate. If a new face comes into the thing, they run to them and hug them. They're not looking at the color. They just know there's another child to play with. So with that, before we go, I'd like to give the opportunity for one of you to say a final thought in 30 seconds. Who would like to do that?
I will. I am, again, grateful for this time and being with all of you, and feels like a full circle moment. And I absolutely know that this trip and our time together is going to be one that is going to be learning and educational, and it will also be filled with, as you said, so much safety and love, and we will all learn and grow together. And that just by the act of showing up and witnessing what is going on in that experience, we will assist in making the world a better place and having more harmony and understanding so our children can continue to be raised just seeing one another and loving and celebrating one another. That's my goal, for us to be like preschoolers again, just loving on each other and being happy with one another and enjoying one another instead of all of these other things that we have learned as adults.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Sandra Jackson, Reverend Patty Rumpza. It's been a pleasure. And to our
it has. Thank you,
listening
Carolyn.
audience, we thank you for listening to Take on Faith. This is Reverend Carolyn Wilkins. And please join next week when Reverend Jelani will return with another special guest. Again, this is Reverend Carolyn Wilkins. Remember, each day is an opportunity to brighten someone else's day. Wishing you love, peace, and joy.
You've been listening to Take on Faith on KTAL-LP FM 101.5 in Las Cruces, New Mexico. If you have comments about today's program, please email me at xk@revdrxk.com. Be sure to get vaccinated, wear your mask, and stay safe out there. I'm your host, Kalani Kachela.